Hi everybody, my name's Dan Wells and I write horror, fantasy, and science fiction, and I talk about games on the internet. Today I'm going to talk about a Swedish game called Agents of Concordia. Swedish RPGs are kind of a huge, massive boom right now, led by things like Tales from the Loop. Agents of Concordia was kickstarted a year or two ago. I just recently picked up a PDF of it. The concept behind it is really compelling. That it is multi-dimensional spies in the 1960s. The content of the book doesn't really bear that out. The connection to Earth and the connection to the 1960s is there, but it's very tenuous. What is there, though, is a really interesting multiverse concept and some absolutely fascinating world descriptions and settings that you can play in. So let's take a look at the good and the bad of Agents of Concordia. Take a look at our big PDF here. So, Agents of Concordia, the system is actually pretty simple. Well, let's look at this first. So the multiverse, this is their map of it, okay? That there's the singularity, which is a bunch of weird bad stuff. And then down here on the other side is the primal, which is a bunch of weird bad stuff. And in the middle is the stable part of the multiverse. And there are two planets that serve as like the end caps to that, being Earth and being Artifex. Artifex is like a big, huge, well, there's actually a really good picture of it. It's kind of the defensive wall against the onslaught of evil monsters. And here we go. Here's the picture. So there's a really great picture. So there's all kinds of horrible monsters called vagrants that don't really have a dimensional home, and so they keep trying to invade other dimensions, and so they will come through, and most of them try to come through artifacts. And so a big part of what the Concordia does, which is the group that keeps all the different worlds and dimensions separate and safe, is it built this giant wall and then it defends it and stops the vagrants from coming through. That isn't really a part of the gameplay, so to speak. This isn't designed as a war game. You're not, bravely holding the wall against invaders like you would in, say, Legend of the Five Rings with the Crab Clan. But what you do have is the possibility of, trying to catch the ones that do slip through, and then maybe going through into the primal to do certain missions and things like that. Anyway, let's go back to our map. The other end cap is Earth. Earth is the only member of the Concordia that doesn't know it's a member of the Concordia. For reasons that are not very well explained, they have decided to keep Earth in the dark. Earth doesn't have a lot of magic. In fact, humans are unique in the multiverse in that they are completely shut off and often immune to magic. So Earth is this kind of wild, all kinds of things have happened there that apparently don't happen in other parts of the multiverse. Our nature has kind of run amok. We have wider variation of species. And in fact, a part of that is, there's some rumors and there's some hints within the Concordia that a lot of Earth's creatures and animals and so on, including humans, are devolved versions of the people that live in other parts of the multiverse, which explains why, when we get to a werewolf or something, we can kind of trace that back and go, oh yeah, okay, maybe Earth used to have werewolves and then they just turned into normal wolves. Same thing with a species that's called Atom that have like human heads and things. I mean, human bodies with animal heads, things like that. So anyway, most of what you do in the game, and the pitch, like I said, the game was sold as you're going to be here on Earth in the 1960s and you're going to be solving multidimensional problems. There's actually zero help given in the book of how to run that kind of a game. It's there and you could do it, but you'll be doing all the work yourself. Most of the book actually is descriptions of the Concordia itself. Concordia Prime, which is the big main kind of Washington, D.C. area, and then all of these other worlds. And there are a surprising number of really interesting and compelling worlds that are described here in the game. So really quick, let's take a look at the system. Like I said, we're going to skip through there and find it. The rules. Okay, so basically you've got a bunch of attributes, and then you've got a bunch of skills. There's actually 30 skills in the game, though they're split into 5 categories that makes them a little easier to understand. You know, it's still nowhere near the amount of skills you would get in, say, a Palladium game, but it's a little more organized, it's a little more interesting. So there's traits and there's skills, and you combine the dice. That's kind of becoming a really common game mechanic these days. You don't combine the dice, you combine something else. Anyway, the way that it works is those attributes can be anywhere from -6 to +6, and then they've got what's called support and cripple effects. I'm not a big fan of the word cripple in this context, especially when it is used basically to help. It's kind of like advantage and disadvantage in D&D 5. If you have a special reason to be good at something, you get support, which is +3 to your roll. And if you have a special reason to be bad at something, you get cripple, which is -3 to the roll. I assume that this is a weird translation issue coming from Swedish, and that, anyway, it's a very weird term that kind of made me blink a little bit and feel more than a little uncomfortable throughout. I have not actually played this game, though I do think the system is compelling. I would very probably change support and cripple to just advantage and disadvantage in play, because I've got a mom with a chronic illness who's been in a wheelchair my whole life, and cripple's kind of a really sensitive word. Anyway, let's actually go through the, while we're talking about the rules, let's go all the way to the back of the book and take a look at the character sheet, okay? Because I think that that's always a really good way of seeing how this works. So, character sheet, it's a two-sided. You could absolutely do this in other ways. First of all, character level is called clearance level, and given that you're part of a kind of spy agency, I think that's a really fun little just thing. They've got perks that are kind of like feats, kind of like talents in a lot of other games. These are all very simple, and they're things like towering, which just means you're bigger than most people. And so, again, that's where those advantage and disadvantage checks would come into play. And so a lot of this is all just kind of very flavor stuff. The second side is where you get into this. You've got your 6 attributes up here. And then down here you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different categories of skills. And so depending on the kind of scene that you're running, you know which one is going to be more valuable to you. If you're in a fight of any kind, whether that is physical or verbal or whatever, then you can use some of these things. And so, I like how they all have, every category has a check that helps you learn more about what's going on. So if you're trying to sneak through something, you can check somebody's motive and see if you think they're lying to you. If you're just trying to study something or observe something, then you can check the setting. And you roll on your check setting skill, and that enables you to learn valuable things about where you are. And each one of these has something like that. These little kind of dots, these diamond-shaped looking things, are how good you are at the skill. And then these boxes underneath are called tenths. And that's kind of how the character advancement system works. And there's a neat little checklist, and after every session that you play, you can kind of run through your little checklist and say, well, did you complete your mission objectives? Did you do X, Y, and Z things? And for every one that you answer yes to, you get to check off a 10th somewhere. And as soon as you have filled up all 10 of these, then you get another dot in the thing. So it's a really kind of neat character advancement system that uses the setting they've come up with and then actually cares about what you did. I do have a tendency personally to enjoy milestone experience, where you just play a few sessions and then the game master says, all right, everybody level up. But not every game lends itself to that, because not every game uses levels quite as clearly and obviously as something like D&D does. This I enjoy, and in a way it's very similar to Pendragon and kind of sort of similar as well to Warhammer, in that the things you do the most often you're going to become better at. And I find that to be a cool and compelling character advancement system. Anyway, the system, let's just jump ahead. It's pretty smooth and it works pretty well, and we're going to move on. Okay? So, there's this couple of pages here that explain the background of how the Concordia came to be, and it's okay, but honestly it's not super complete, and you're going to read it and go, well, okay, what do I do now? Then they've got this CCI section, which is the Concordia Central Intelligence. This is the spy agency that you work for, and I call it a spy agency, but it isn't really. It's more of just a government agency assigned with keeping the peace. It's the United Nations more so than the CIA. But that said, they do have secret operatives, and they do send you out, and you are often called upon to infiltrate different things and, work with, perform missions that will further the aims of peace and prosperity within the multiverse. And they've got, some various descriptions of things, but then here's the real meat of it, in my opinion. This very impressive selection of worlds. And they've really gone out of their way to make a bunch of worlds that do feel unique and different and weird, which I really appreciate in a multiverse game. So first of all, they start with Earth. And right away you can tell that this book is going to be interesting, because they have shape listed as one of the three core traits of every world. And you're like, oh, Earth is a sphere? What are the rest of them going to be? So it's a medium sphere, and natives are the native species, the native sentient species, are humans and stewards. Stewards are basically intelligent animals. Again, like I said earlier, there's rumors within the Concordia that Earth is home to a lot of devolved species. And so something like a talking dog is just, a dog that is born as like a genetic throwback to some prior, dog or werewolf species or something like that is intelligent. And so they exist in here, and there's a cute little kind of Bremerton musicians picture of them. Anyway, then we move on to, next one, Concordia Prime, which is small, is also a sphere, and it doesn't have any natives. Everybody lives there. This is the Coruscant of the multiverse. This is the phase world. This is where everybody comes together. And it has this really kind of cool, steampunky, Art Deco kind of look to it, which is really neat. And you'll think, hey, this is really cool. I want to read more about this. Well, tough luck. You get 3 paragraphs. Was it 3 or only 2? It's 3 paragraphs. Okay, Donum is, I assume, named after a donut, because its shape is a flat disc with a gaping chasm in the middle. And its natives are called Nonsense, and they're basically goblins. And so Donum is this, a flat disc, like it says, that is full of valuable ore. It's been mined so much that it's actually starting to fall apart. And it is this nasty, polluted wasteland, but that is still sort of fiscally valuable. And so it's basically ruled by different corporations of miners and manufacturers who are these kind of very Victorian workman-looking kind of goblin people. Anyway, it's really weird, and it's really different, and I really dig it. Next we have something like Helix, which is a very large, and it's a spherical planet, but one of the compelling things about this place is that their power system, they have the highest level of technology anywhere in the multiverse. Their power system is based on the life force of the sentient species that lives there, which is called the Alden. And so if somebody is born, somebody else has to die right at the same time. And if somebody dies, say they get murdered, then if there's not another person to be born and immediately equalize that life force, there could be power outages and rolling blackouts and all kinds of problems all over the world. And so you don't learn much about any of these planets, but what you do learn is very cool and unique and interesting. And you say, oh, I can think of 2 or 3 stories right off the top of my head that would deal with that weird power system. And what happens? What happens if a serial killer gets loose? What happens if, a mad scientist does something wrong and tries to tap into that and messes with the way the power flows? And how does that feed back into the population? There's lots of ideas. There are no adventure ideas in the book, but there's a lot of really cool setting ideas that can absolutely spark a lot of really fascinating adventure ideas. So here we go. The August Menagerie is a giant cube that is filled with massive cave cages for dangerous species. Now this sounds awesome, and again, you can think of a lot of really good stories to tell. Some of these cages, so to speak, these caves, are so large that the people who live in them don't know that they're in a cage. But at the same time, there's a lot of questions you'll have to ask yourself, like what is being held in these cages? It never says. How does this cubical dimension work? Is it like a cubical planet? What happens if you go to the bottom of it? Is the gravity consistent top to bottom and all in one direction, or is there a central core around which everything orbits? A lot of these questions that, in my opinion, are pretty important to how to play in this world are never answered. What happens if you go outside of the cube? Can you go outside of the cube? I don't know, and the game doesn't tell you, and it's frustrating, and there's a lot of things like that in the game. Subara is a really incredible world that's like a big undersea world that has a few coral mountains that stick up above the surface of the water. And in the past, these warring kind of merfolk people, very kind of shape of watery looking people, ape sapien, they created these gigantic sea monsters in order to fight wars against each other. And then they lost control of the sea monsters. The sea monsters destroyed their civilization, and so now these once great, incredible, civilizations live as tiny little refugee camps on these outcroppings of coral, unable to reclaim their lost home. And so there's a lot of cool potential for adventure there, going down under the sea to try to reclaim some lost artifacts and staying hidden from the sea monsters and all kinds of stuff like that. The Great Caravan, again, sounds so neat. It's a huge train pulled by beasts of burden, but it never says what kind, through, I assume, the void, but I don't know what that looks like. It just moves around. It's inhabited by bird and dragon people, and some of the kind of train cars are giant flatbeds with sleeping dragons on them. That sounds awesome. I don't know where they are. I don't know how they travel from world to world. Everyone else has to go through gates. Do these guys have to go through gates, or they just out in the void by themselves? What is that like to be out in the void by themselves? Is there air? Can they breathe? If they get off of the train, do they fall? Is there ground for them to walk on? How do these beasts of burden pull the train? I have no idea. The game is not interested in telling you. It's very frustrating. Aeneid is kind of like an ancient Egyptian kind of world. You can see a little bit of a statue here and then a giant person. This is ruled by 2 species that really turns into 3. Atoms are basically humans that are slightly more magical. Chuna are atoms that are even more magical and are starting to gain kind of animal features like jackal heads and rhino heads and stuff like that. And then they have the super powerful people who are called something else, and I can't see it on here. Oh, um, there's each house, and there's many houses that control the world, is ruled by a monarch who designates a diplomat and an ambassador underneath them, and then when the monarch dies, they'll pick which one takes over, and so they will gain incredible power. And that's what this giant here is in the back, is one of those monarchs. Anyway, this is apparently rife with politics. What kind of politics? What do they care about? What are they trying to do? That is entirely up to you, because the book doesn't say. And this one is like a Mayan one. I'm not going to go through all of them. This is the last one I'm going to do because I think it's really fascinating. It is a flat disc that has people on both sides of it. And it's kind of an ancient Mayan thing with both ogres and like horned dwarves as an upper class and a lower class. And so there's the good side, where the ogres are trying to be good and the people all live in peace. And then there's the dark side, where the ogres are evil and they do blood sacrifices and they do all this horrible stuff. This is really cool, especially because the Akan here live in like a doubled life. There is a light twin and a dark twin, which has nothing to do with coloration or race or anything, just with good or evil. And this sounds really fascinating, and I really love the idea of it. Also, the Prismborn are basically kind of a magical stone technology of kind of Mayan magical robots that are kind of stone housings for dead ogres who have passed on, and then their spirit can inhabit this statue, and they are a playable character race. All of these are playable character races, which is all really fascinating, but again, there's a lot of questions. How does that actually work? Is it similar to Helix, where if the light one dies, then the dark one also like dies? There's hints that that's true, but if that's true, and if the dark side is constantly sacrificing people, what does it say down here? It's like hundreds of sacrifices a day or some insane thing like that. On the other side, in dark Omeyokan, Solat the blood-soaked rules eternal by sacrificing subject equal to his age at the dawn of the calendar cycle, fueling his dark and powerful magic. So if he is killing like millions of people every year, and if they're twinned, then millions of the light side Akan would also be dying. But how does that work? Also, how are both sides members of the Concordia, and apparently it's totally legal to just do blood sacrifices of millions of people? Like, there's so many questions, and they drive me crazy. Anyway, there's a ton more different worlds that we could talk about, and I'm not going to talk about them. We're going to skip through, and we're going to go look at the races now, the playable character races. So here's the player's handbook. Part of the other problem, and again I'm willing to chalk this up to translation, is that you will read through this whole character thing a good 3 or 4 times before you understand exactly how to build a character and create your attributes and things like that. So anyway, it gives, talks about all they call them basic abilities, their attributes. Talks about them, what they can do, gives example uses of them, and I really dig it. It's a really handy system. Does the same thing with skills. How do the skills work? What are the skills for? We're going to skip further down, and we're going to find the playable character races here. Where's that? Oh no, these are the backgrounds. I really love... Okay, so there's a bunch of cool perks, but then we're going to talk about backgrounds, if I can find where the backgrounds start. No, these are all perks. So the perks are really fun, and they do really neat things. And there's more perks. And character creation. Here we go. This is when we get into backgrounds. I really like character creation systems that care about who you used to be. And we're starting to see this even in D&D. They've got a background system in 5th edition. And it doesn't really add much, but it adds something, and it adds some flavor to you. You weren't always an adventurer. You weren't always a spy or whatever you are in here, an agent of the Concordia. Maybe you started off as, you know, a noble. Maybe you started off as a criminal. Maybe you started off as something else, you know, a nomad traveling around doing nothing. And that will give you a couple of little perks and things and dots, and it's a neat system. We're going to skip through it, though, to find the species. There are a ton of them. And like I said, all of the races described in the worlds section are playable races here. So here's the dual, you know, light and dark Akan, and they've got a bunch of rules, and they'll give you some perks and basic abilities and so on. There's the Alden, they're the ones that live in Helix. There's the Atom, which are like the slightly magical humans. Automatons are robots that live in one world. I love these guys. These are called cadavers. There's one kind of dark horror world that's ruled by what are called Lamia, that are basically vampires. These are like little undead spirit Frankenstein monster kind of things, and I love them. Aren't they adorable? I would totally play one of these. And it goes through like this, and there's so many of them. The Tuna are the kind of magical animal head people from Aeneid. Fawns are unique humans, get their own little description. They are resistant to magic. Anyway, you get the idea here. We don't need to go through every single one of them. So at the end of the day, I have very mixed feelings about this game. On the one hand, the level of creativity put into the worlds and the species, I think, is incredible. Somebody spent a long time making this multiverse game really feel like an interesting, cool multiverse. Where the game falls apart a little bit is the actual play of the adventures, the actual storyline behind it. Because like I've said a couple of times, there are plenty of ideas that you can grab hold of and go, okay, I know something neat I can do with this. But you have to do all of that work yourself. The one adventure, they have like a starting intro adventure in the back of the book, and it's terrible. It's one of the worst intro adventures I've ever seen. It doesn't address that multiverse spies concept in any way. It is poorly written, poorly structured. I was really just kind of astonished by it. I read through the book, loved it, loved a lot of it, and then I got to that adventure and was so soured on the game I almost took it off my review schedule, because I don't review games unless I like them. And that review really was just, I mean, that intro at the end was like, ah! Anyway, I do like the game, though, and I do think that there is something neat there. But what it does not have, and what it desperately needs, is some kind of game master section. And it has a little game master section that's like, here's how you do a role-playing game, and you could tell that they know what they're talking about. One of the things I loved about their game master section was that step one of running a session is called de-derping. So all your friends show up and you spend about 20 minutes catching up and joking around with each other, and then you start the game. And I love that, because that is absolutely true to my experience. You do have to spend some time getting all those wiggles out so that everyone can sit down and focus on the game. Calling it de-derping is especially wonderful. But advice on how to run role-playing games in general is useful if you've never run one. It is what they do not have is advice on how to run this particular game. What kinds of stories you can tell. How you can use the multiverse. How you can use that 1960s Earth setting that they hyped up so much. How you can use, the vagrants in a story. How do, if the primary antagonists are these big giant interdimensional monsters, how do you build a spy-style story about fighting them? some of the monsters, it has a big monster section that I didn't go through and show you. But some of the monsters, just like the worlds and just like the species, are incredibly cool. They have one monster who is literally an idea, like an earworm song. You can be possessed by a monster that just focuses your brain on one specific melody or tune or something, and then you can't get it out. That is such an incredible idea. There's so much there. What does that do to you? I don't know. How can you use that in a game? I don't know. Um, and so I feel like I say this with a lot of my reviews, but a game master who is willing to put in all the work of building adventures with these tools can absolutely play a really cool game. It's kind of like buying a Lego set that doesn't have an instruction book. What can you build? Well, there's some pictures on the box, and that can inspire you, but really it is entirely up to you. So if you are willing to put in that effort and come up with your own ideas, then absolutely, I think you could do some really cool multiverse stuff, because the setting information and the rules system are both really solid. If you are not willing to do that, if you were hoping that this would be more pick up and play and that there'd be a lot more guidance, not more railroad, but at least some handrails so you don't fall off the cliff, if that's what you're hoping for, then Agents of Concordia is not going to work for you. If, on the other hand, you have been inspired by any of the neat ideas that I have told you about in this review, and you think, okay, yes, I want to dive in and do that, then okay, more power to you. Agents of Concordia is pretty cool and can work really well for you. So anyway, there you go. That's my review. Like I said, my name is Dan Wells. I write a lot of books, and I'd appreciate it if you'd go read them. I also am a professional game master in addition to an author and a reviewer. And so if you would like me to run a game for you or your group, a one-shot or a campaign or anything, absolutely. There's going to be a link in the comments below or in the video description or something. Anyway, you're awesome, and I will see you on my next review.